Welcome to Change Talks, your go-to podcast about mastering change in business and life. And today, my guest is Sean Grace. Sean is a communication consultant, coach, and author with over 25 years of experience. He is helping to develop sales, marketing, and leadership professionals across various industries. And Sean has a very diverse bio. I may almost call him a Renaissance man because his background blends media, advertising, creative arts, and even jazz music. And on that, surely later on. So he's a man who definitely brings a fresh perspective to leadership and leading to change. But that's not all, because we will also discuss his book, The Art of the Question. And because the subheadline of this book goes a guide for seekers, dreamers, problem solvers, and leaders, quite long, I'm sure that we have very interesting discussion ahead. So Sean, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on, Victor. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you here too, Sean, and let's talk about the change.
Change Talks, your passport to exciting changes in your business, career, and life. Change Talks, your podcast when it's time to do things differently.
Sean, when I was preparing for this episode and screening your bio, what immediately caught my attention were your studies because you studied music performance, right? And moreover, you are an award-winning musician and multi-instrumentalist. So how come that right now you are a communication consultant, coach, and author of a book?
Mm. Well, that's a good question. And my journey is long and interesting, but it did start out in the music world. From a very young age, I was performing and competing at a very high level internationally in the classical music world. And so I figured, okay, my career is definitely going to be in the music world. However, making it in the music world is a lot more difficult than I thought as a young kid. So to supplement my living and my making a living, I took a job in sales, which turns out I was pretty good at. And then very quickly, I became a sales trainer, training others in the art of persuasion and negotiation. And from that, I continued both careers, music, certainly not as my primary source of income, but definitely a major source of satisfaction for me artistically and otherwise. However, I was able to borrow a lot of ideas from both arenas, especially in the arts as it applied to communication, as it came to creative collaboration, when it came to teamwork. And so I continued in the world of management, in media and marketing, specifically in advertising in New York. Spent many years managing many different types of teams in the marketing and sales arena. And eventually, I stepped out and started my own consultancy, bringing a lot of the skills in both the world of creative collaboration that I gained from the music world, as well as my experience in marketing, media, and leadership. So from that, I was able to offer my advisory and consulting services to a variety of companies looking to improve their communication and their creative collaboration and innovation efforts. So I was able to refine a lot of these ideas over the many years, until eventually I started producing workshops, and one of them became The Art of the Question. And from that, many years later, 5 or 6 years later of doing that workshop, I decided, hey, I think there might be a book here. So I sat down and put it all together. And about a year plus later, I birthed my first book, The Art of the Question. As you say, a guide for seekers, dreamers, problem solvers, and leaders. And yeah, that sounds all inclusive, but that sort of brings in a lot of what my experience has been in the world of creative arts, as well as the world of media, marketing, and business leadership. So that's sort of the short, abridged version of my journey from the world of music performance, which still exists, by the way, all the way to the world of consultant, speaker, and author of the new book.
That's quite interesting. And by the way, what instruments do you play?
Yeah, well, my main instrument that I did most of my studying and performance was the flute, and is the flute. So that's my, I guess, my main axe, as they say. However, I'm also pretty familiar with a lot of other instruments. So I play piano, I play guitar, bass, percussion, and a variety of other different types of instruments. But certainly the flute would be, I would say, the main instrument that would define me as an accomplished player.
Interesting. I was curious because I don't play any instrument. I just do not have any skills for that. As a small boy, I was forced to play piano, to get some formal education. It was horrible. It was horrible. So I think rather we will go the topic that is more close to my heart, which is the change. So you said that the past kind of naturally led you towards writing the book about the questioning. Yeah. Now, does it mean that you perceive that as a gap in the skill set of the managers, of the leaders? Why is that?
Yeah, I did discover that, and a lot of that came out of the feedback I was receiving in my other communication workshops. In addition to design thinking and other types of workshops I was producing, a lot of it came back to the ability to ask good questions in order to solve problems, in order to resolve conflicts, in order to be more innovative and creative. So I found that a lot of the workshops would kind of not necessarily always center, but questions became a primary part of a lot of the other types of communication workshops. So the feedback became, hey, we want to learn more about this thing called questioning as it relates to leading others, as it relates to just being innovative and solving difficult problems. So yes, there was and is what I considered a fairly substantial gap in the participants that I was working with, and these are very well educated, mostly in the sciences, managers and engineers and scientists who were very good at solving certain problems and good in a lot of respects. But when it came to asking deeper questions, being able to use questions in a way to communicate more effectively, and as well as answer or ask questions that could spark creative ideas, as it relates to change as well. A lot of this is about change, right? It seemed to keep coming back to this idea of questioning. So, yes, to answer your question, it was really a reaction in response to this widening gap that I saw with the teams I was working with, where they were very interested to learn more about this skill.
I remember to read somewhere that a small kid is asking on average, hundreds of questions. I think it was between 300 or 400 questions a day.
Right.
While as adults, we only ask a couple of dozen questions, something like that, 10, 20 questions. So what is behind that? Does it mean that we grow so damn smart that we don't need to ask any more questions? Is it because we become more ignorant? What is behind that trend, of asking less and less questions?
Yeah, it's a phenomena that I do address in the book. And I think the statistic is something like 350 to 400 questions a day for the average 4-year-old, and the average adult is between 10 and 20 questions. And I think there's a combination of a couple of things. Certainly, there's a point when we hit sort of early adolescence where our knowledge of the world is such that we don't need to ask as many questions. So there's an automatic ability to kind of know more. So you're less asking your parents or your brothers and sisters about basic things about the world. However, What happens as you reach your early adolescence, your social construct within your peer group becomes more and more dominant. And the idea of raising your hand to ask a question in class becomes a little more risky from a standpoint of either not looking informed in front of your colleagues and your peers, or maybe in some cases looking too informed. So I think what happens is there's an inhibition that kicks in because, again, our social status takes over once we hit adolescence. And that, I think what happens is it tends to impede our natural tendency to inquire about things because the risks that might be posed by our peers just might be a little too threatening for a lot of people. So what happens is that we become less willing to put ourselves on the line to ask questions that may, for some, appear, well, didn't you know the answer to that already, type of thing. So then what happens is that we get into the business world where answers are valued, solutions are valued, of course, more than asking questions and discovery. So sitting around a meeting table in your new position, maybe asking lots of questions might once again come across as, is this person incompetent? Are they, same
Too
type
junior
of
for the job, perhaps, right? This kind of perception.
Sorry, say it again.
So the perception that the person is too junior for the position, for the job.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're at least the myth is that you're being hired for your knowledge and your experience and your expertise. You're here to help us answer questions, not ask them. However, what I've discovered is those, especially in leadership, who are the most effective, and not even just in leadership, just in generally problem solving, are the ones that continue asking the good questions, are the ones that prompt others to think a little about how they perceive their own problems, etc. I find that those are the individuals that over time I learned, hey, they seem to have a lot going on, as opposed to the ones that sit quietly and don't ask any questions. So I think it's a combination as to why we tend to pull back on that. I think some of it is just natural evolution in our overall knowledge acquisition. And then in addition to that, the social pressures that will exist and do exist to make us a little more inhibited in our willingness to raise our hand and say, hey, why is this the way it is?
So obviously, if we are reluctant, if we are too shy to ask the questions, we are limiting ourselves to the information that may help us to grow, change business, whatever, right? So how mastering the art of questioning can help leaders and entrepreneurs to be more successful? How to overcome these social barriers?
Yeah, that's a good question. How to answer that question, though, is probably rather complex, depending on who you are and the context and the circumstance that you're in. But questioning is a skill that I consider sort of a muscle that either atrophies or continues to build. And I think it's up to anyone who is interested in becoming an effective change agent or effective leader or manager, or even just a good partner, to be able to ask the right questions, to be able to use questioning as a catalyst for not just getting to answers, but to open up a stimulating conversation, which will open up new doors of ideas and thinking. So questions are really a gateway to exploring ideas, not necessarily always about we're looking for an answer here. So I consider good questioning, especially on the part of leaders, to be exceptionally powerful in their ability to stimulate, inspire the teams that are reporting to those leaders. So it's not necessarily always about asking the right questions to get the right answer. It's about asking great questions in order to stimulate and inspire those around you to think more creatively about how they go about either solving or discovering or exploring the possibilities of a particular scenario. So the question isn't just a singular tool to get to a specific answer. Questions of themselves are these vibrant, organic tools, which I think open up all kinds of ability to communicate in a better way, if that makes sense.
Hmm. But there is one thing that probably goes hand in hand with asking the right sort of questions, right? Because one thing is master the art of asking the questions, and we will still go to that. But to really use this to our full advantage, there is also the listening skill, right? Because if you are just asking the questions and you are not listening to the responses, and it doesn't work, does it? So,
No, you're right.
How do you see now, what's your experience looking at the very senior leaders and managers? Are they really good listeners, or just there is a lot of ego that they like to talk, they like to ask these questions, but they are not really interested in receiving the answers? What's your take on this?
Well, I find that looking back, certainly when I was coming up in the corporate world as a young businessman, there was an overall culture of what I consider command and control, where management and leadership was there to essentially direct and tell the others, line workers, frontline people, teams, to execute XYZ because management decided that this is what needs to be done, and therefore we are to follow the command, right? So leadership was defined from a standpoint of experience, a lot of knowledge, and the ability to give commands. And followership, which is sort of we'll call it followership, we'll call it basically rank and file, was there to follow orders, to be able to listen well enough to be able to get the orders and to carry them through. Now that worked certainly in the early days of industrialization, where a lot of the corporate functions were about producing predictable commodities, as an example. However, over the years, I noticed a shift in where that no longer became the imperative. What more and more companies were looking for were leaders who were able to have vision, to be strategic, to be able to inspire teams in order for them to solve problems on the line in the moment, to be able to be nimble, to be able to pivot easily and quickly, as companies needed to become just more agile in their ability to respond to market conditions, competition, technology changes, all of these things. So as change became more rapid within the corporate environment, there was a need, and is a need, for leaders to be able to not act as commanders and controllers, but as inspirational leaders, to ask great questions of talented people that they've hired, to be able to think more broadly and more creatively about how to either solve a problem or innovate in a way that that may not be so obvious. So there is a generational gap, I think, in the type of thinking from the more standardized corporate command and control to a more modern, flexible, agile, nimble, creative type of leadership and teamwork that is required today, because things are rapidly changing so quickly. If you're not asking great questions of your teams and not just coming to them with answers and saying this is what needs to be done now, you're probably going to be left behind, because it's often the frontline teams that are able to notice, to be able to see things that the senior management just can't, right? Because they're just living in two different worlds to a certain degree. So You need to empower the people that report to you. And the only way to empower them properly is to give them the agency to be able to solve problems on their own, to be able to inspire them through great questioning. And that's the shift that I've seen. And I think that's where the demand comes from now, and the interest in the book as well, that there does seem to be a general understanding that this is what's needed in today's leadership.
So the understanding of the importance of the right questions, of the great questions, is now on the table. Now we are circulating around this term, this expression, great question. So what actually is the great question? What makes a great question? Yeah. How to distinguish? Is it a great question? No, that one was not a good one. So
Right.
what's the distinction? You know, what are the signs of a good question?
Well, I'd like to think a good question is a question that really stimulates thinking, especially creative thinking. And I have a hard time saying that something's a really bad question or something's a poor question. I think that all questions have their merit, but some are greater than others. And the great ones, I think, are the ones that cause people to say, wow, I never thought of it that way. Let me reflect on that and see what happens. So a great question a leader would ask would be based upon stimulating that and triggering that reflection within the team or within the person you're speaking with, to think upon the way they're happen to be looking at something. So this is something I certainly talk a lot about in the book. A more productive question versus a not so productive question. For instance, an example would be, especially with interpersonal relationships. And the second part of the book, I have 3 parts of the book. Second part is really about human connection. That is how we communicate with other human beings, and what are the questions that work better and maybe not so better in certain circumstances. And I have a thing called the problem with why. And why is a great question for a lot of reasons. It points to sort of, okay, what is the reason? What's the purpose? What's the mission, right? So why gives us a sense of purpose. However, why can be a little dangerous when it comes to interpersonal communication, because why can be perceived as excusatory or accusatory. So for instance, one example would be if you come home with, or say your partner comes home from work, walks in the house, looks around and makes a declaration or asks the question, why is this house always such a mess? Now, that question may be a legitimate question, and they may be looking for a root cause, but likely they're not really looking for a root cause. They certainly have a strong opinion as to why the house isn't in great shape, and their partner may get that and say, oh, I'm sorry, you're right, I should really do more around here. However, more likely than not, you're not going to get that reaction, and you're going to get a defensive reaction, which essentially says, hey, I do a lot around here. You should really pull your own weight. And before you know it, you're in an argument about who does what around the house. So in that situation, the why is not a great question in that case, because what it does is it indirectly points the finger at the person that you're asking the why question. They end up getting into a defensive posture and either creates excuses as to why or points the finger back. However, if your partner walks in from work and looks around and says, how might we keep this house more tidy on a regular basis? Now, what's powerful about that is that you're not directly pointing the finger at your partner. There isn't a passive aggressiveness to it. The problem, being the house not being clean, becomes an issue that's separated from both people. So a how question will give a little distance to the other person so they don't feel personally wrapped around it, that it's an accusation about who they are. And they become a problem-solving partner. And they actually say, hey, okay, well, let's come up with ways in order for us to maybe accomplish that, right? So it's prescriptive, it's solution-oriented, it's motivated, it's directed, and it's future-based. Whereas a why question in that same scenario is focused primarily at causes and reasons, and those aren't necessarily the most productive types of questions depending on the circumstance. So there's an example of what I consider a better question versus what I consider maybe not a great productive question. So these are just examples of why versus how, which is, in my opinion, one of the more powerful changes one could make with thinking twice about, can I reframe this question as a how question versus a why question? And would that work better based on who I'm speaking with? And a lot of time you'll find that the how question may very well be more productive. So there's an example of what I would consider to be a better question versus a not so great question.
Yeah, what do you say about the why question? I can really confirm that by 100% from even the business experience, right? Because as a change coach, I'm working with my clients, on improving processes, sales channels, and so on. And mapping is usually, the first thing that you do. And I realized that, asking the questions starting with why, as you say, puts people very often on the defensive. They feel it like, that you are kind of pointing a finger to them and accusing them that the process is slow. And you say, okay, why does it take, that long? They immediately take it very personally sometimes. So it's better, as you advise, to rephrase the question, not to start with why and not putting people on the defensive. So not only in family life, cleaning, but also in the business. So I think that's a first maybe good tip, right? How to ask the questions and how not to ask the questions.
Well,
Maybe stay a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have another quick example. I remember one of my very first jobs in management, and I was brought onto this company, and I was running a team of 6 or 7 salespeople, and sat down my first few weeks, and I saw that the numbers were not great for the year, and we were probably halfway through the year, and we weren't just nobody was hitting their numbers, So I went around the table. And I said, why aren't you hitting your numbers? What's going on with your territory? Oh, well, the economy's not great. The competition has this new thing, and it's really draining a lot of business from us, and our market share is starting to suffer as a result of it, and what we really need to do is this, and that's. So I went around the table. Each one of them would build upon the other person. Oh, he's right, absolutely. But in addition to that, here's another reason why my numbers are down, right? So I went around the table, and it was quite depressing. And after 20 or 30 minutes of this, it became clear that we weren't going to reach our numbers, right? These are professionals. I'm brand new. Who am I, right, to come in and come up with other ways to do things? So I sat there. I said, okay, well, that's kind of disheartening, to tell you the truth. So I stood up and I walked over to a whiteboard and I took out a magic marker, and I wrote the question, how might we reach our sales goals? So I sat back down, I pointed to the first person, I said, let's start again. Can you answer the question up on the board? Well, as I said, forget about what you just said. Answer that question. Okay, so before you know it, he started saying, well, how might we? Well, we might be able to introduce a new a new extension to the product, which will help in certain areas. If we can maybe put together some type of program. Oh, okay. What about the next person? Next person then built on that. Oh, yeah, that's not a bad idea. We might be able to actually do this in my territory because there's this new thing going on that we might be able to counteract, and blah, blah, blah. So around 20 minutes later, I had 20 good ideas, of which probably 5 or 6 were quite viable. And those 5 or 6 ideas essentially allowed us to reach our goals. And the only difference was the difference between asking why we weren't getting there to how might we get there. So there was an early example of me as a sales manager trying to figure out how to solve a big problem, which I felt was very much solvable, but it really had it really relied on a change in attitude and a change in perspective. And that question was able to do that.
So basically, a weak question will either get you excuses and retrospective on the past, while the strong, good question will lead you more to the future and to the solution, right? So you mentioned why as a one of the red flag in terms of questioning. Are there any other red flags how not to ask questions that people do very often and don't understand the negative impact they are creating?
Mm. Wow. Well, I mean, there's so many subtleties to all of this, and context is everything. Why obviously is a great question when it comes to deductive reasoning. There's a technique called the five whys that I teach and I use, and so why definitely has its place, especially when it comes to trying to find an answer that we know exists. So there's a deductive process to the reasoning. Why can maybe get you there. So there's lots of different ways to use questions. I'm not ever saying don't use why. Why is very powerful. Just be careful because it is so powerful. How, as you say, directed towards the future. But then you have the what, the whens, and the whos, and the other what we call the interrogatives, which are the key words which set up our questions. There is another problem in the world of interpersonal relationships with the word should. Now, should seems innocent enough, right? Should you do this? Shouldn't you do that? Maybe you should do this, whatever. Sometimes they're statements, sometimes they're questions. But should, like why with people, can also be problematic. So what I call in the book the trouble with should and the problem with why, should can also become debilitating in the standpoint that it presumes that there's a right way to do something, right? And so it sets up once again, sort of in a passive aggressive way, it sets up the other person a bit. Shouldn't you do this? You know what you should do is this. Shouldn't you consider this other thing? Now, those shouldn't you, okay, may not be as bad as you should do this. Because when you say you should do this to somebody, you may very well be right, but you are, to a large degree, disempowering them to make their own decision, to feel like they own that decision. It brings some guilt to the mental frame. It makes assumptions as to that there is only one right way to do this, and this is the one way that it should be done. So should is an example that doesn't always fall under the question realm, but it is part of the communication arena that can trigger, similar to why, a defensive, or if not even just defensive, just more of like, okay, you're right, I'm wrong, but often they'll walk away not necessarily more empowered. They'll just feel more guilty about not exercising more, or not eating well, or whatever it is that you happen to be talking to them about. So should is another word that you need to be a little careful about. However, all the other questions, depending on how you set them up, will determine the direction you're going in. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but there are so many variables to the who, what, where, when, why, how, that it would be impossible to kind of play those all out, So that's my response to that question.
When you mentioned should, I was really laughing because besides what you say about using it in a question as a problem, because you again are suggesting that the way how the person is doing the things right now is not the right way and it should be done differently. So it's a criticism kind of hidden behind that. The problem I really have is should is that when I talk with people and they talk about their goals and they start a sentence, okay, I should do this, I should do that. And they ask me, okay, how to reach that goal? I said, well, if you start to describe your goal with the expression should, it means that it's actually not your goal, right? It was imposed on you very likely by somebody else. Otherwise, you said, what, I want to do this, I want to do that. If you say I should, you are not really serious. And if you are not very serious about that goal, about that objective, it's not likely that you are going to achieve that, because you have very limited motivation with the first obstacle. You will just give it up. So interesting, how should is also a dangerous expression when it comes to the questioning, to the art of question.
Yeah, and I never really thought much about should until several years ago when someone brought it to my attention, and I said, "Huh, okay," because should is a modal verb, as they call it, and it shows direction and motivation, and it's a very powerful word. However, when you really think about it, as you just mentioned, there are emotional and psychological aspects to that question that could in some ways disempower the person you're speaking with and not give them the sense of power and agency that they might otherwise feel like they could have. So yes, exactly to what you're saying, essentially being, well, there is this right way. I know I should be doing it, and I know I'm not, and so therefore I kind of feel bad about myself, and that's not always a great motivator.
Right. You are saying that the distinguishment between good and bad question also depends on a lot of other factors, who is the person, etc. Are there also any cultural differences that you observed when it comes to asking questions? Some questions that are good, in certain environments, in certain cultures, but definitely you should not, use them when you are, I don't know where, in Japan or whatever.
Yeah. Well, certainly, there are definitely cultural divides when it comes to the world of questioning and inquiry. Some cultures consider some types of questions, a little too intrusive and a little too personal. Whereas in the Western culture, we're much more agreeable with asking maybe questions that dive a little deep into someone's thought process. So once again, context, which includes, not just where you are and the circumstance, but who you're speaking with, is going to determine the willingness of the other person to cooperate or not. So being sensitive to that will give you at least some ability to navigate the cultural differences, so you're not asking questions that might seem a little too intrusive, a little too personal. So it really depends. So to your point, some Asian cultures, you're certainly going to get a more conservative and a sort of a little more tucked in approach to how they're answering questions, or even their own ability to ask questions. There are certainly, I've noticed this in a lot of my workshops, where you get those who grew up in a more Eastern culture, where they're less willing to even ask questions. And so there is that inhibition that goes on, which blocks them, I think, from exploring and discovering new ideas, because they're inhibited for whatever reason. So yeah, I do talk a little about this, not a lot, but a little bit about this from the cultural divide, and it's an area what I call asking permission. So sometimes it's necessary to ask first if it's okay to ask the following questions, and then that will give you an indicator as to, okay, we're okay or we're not. Right? So even asking questions before you ask a question, for instance, asking permission to get into an area that might be a little dicey or a little personal or a little too close to the vest type of thing. Sometimes just asking that simple question, would it be okay if we talk about this particular situation? So asking in advance, and if it's not, then that's fine. Respect that. Back off and change your approach, right? Sometimes even just asking permission automatically opens up avenues of possibility. So even if you're with a colleague who doesn't have necessarily a cultural divide to have to navigate, but simply asking first permission to broach a topic is a sign of respect courtesy, and also give some license to what happens after the person grants permission. So asking permission before you ask a question that you're not totally sure can open up a whole arena of conversation that you may otherwise have thought you needed to dance around. So the permission works from a cultural standpoint. It also works in just a non-cultural divide standpoint by just allowing the other person to give the thumbs up. Yeah, we're okay to talk about that. And that opens up the door wide.
It's basically using the questions in like tactical ways. So to start to think about, okay, the tactics, how to use the question. And usually when the questions are considered like, as important part of the tactics is when it comes to negotiations, right? And some people may feel that asking a question in very like, tough, intense negotiation could be a sign of weakness. What's your opinion on that? Should you ask questions when you are negotiating or restrain from asking the questions? What's the right tactics?
Well, I do talk a little bit about negotiation and persuasion in the book. And I consider questioning a central and critical aspect of any negotiation. Basically, any negotiation is based upon understanding, where the arena is, or what we call sort of the zone of possible agreement, or otherwise known as the ZOPA. And to understand a zone of possible agreement, you'll need to ask some good questions as to, and those questions don't need to be direct. They can be indirect. They could touch upon aspects of the negotiation that will give you information in order to then proceed in a way that will hopefully be more successful for your position. But with negotiating, it's all about trying to understand as much as possible about the other person's motivation, needs, desires, and wants. You're not going to discover that unless you have the information and be able to ask the questions to get the answers. Now, the other person may not be willing to answer any of those questions, and that's fine too. But through the process of asking questions, basic questions about the history of this thing that you're negotiating around, the whys and wherefores of why they're looking to part with it, or offer you whatever it is that you're offering. These things are going to give you the information necessary in order for you to continue bidding or negotiating in a way that's going to get you closer to where you want to go. If you didn't ask any questions, and granted, a lot of times you can't, right? If it's an online bid and the person that's selling whatever they're selling is not willing to answer your questions. But even in eBay, right, the big auction site, you're often in a question-asking posture where you're asking the seller about the item, about why they're looking to sell it, about how soon they're looking, what their urgency is. So there's a whole set of questions one would ask in order to assess, okay, this is a motivated buyer, they're not a motivated buyer, this is the history of the item. They also have other items that are part of a collection, whatever the case is you might be negotiating around. That's going to give you the intel in order for you to be a better negotiator. If there was no exchange of questioning between the two parties, it makes it much more difficult. Now, granted, if you're at Christie's and you're looking to buy a $10 million piece of art, you're not going to ask a lot of questions while you're sitting there. Hopefully your questions were posed prior to that, so you have enough information to be able to bid properly. But questioning, I think, is absolutely critical in any type of negotiation or persuasion situation where you need to find out enough information in order for you to move forward in a confident way. You can't always get the answers, but at least try.
Yeah. The problem that you sometimes do not get the answers can be quite frustrating, I remember a couple of years ago, I was attending training for negotiation, and there was a negotiation game. We were in two groups, and we had to negotiate price, for some goods. I don't know what it was. And it was actually the very first negotiation. So we were all very green, yeah, and everybody was thinking, okay, I need to play this very smart. So the discussion was like, okay, we have these goods, for Sadu, you want to buy? Well, yeah, maybe.
Right.
And what is the price? How much would you like to pay? So both sides actually tried to avoid answering these questions because they felt that answering will put them in the weaker position. So but there may be various reasons why you're the person that's sitting opposite to you is not willing or is reluctant to answer your questions. Is there any kind of trick how to persuade a person, how to make them answer your questions when they are just, stubborn, silent, or just, circling around?
Mm. Wow. Well, it certainly depends on the person you're speaking with, and you're right. A lot of times in negotiations, the other party's not willing to answer a question, especially if it's a direct question. However, there's lots of indirect questions one can ask that will help reveal the answer you're looking for without the other person necessarily being aware of it. Now, what those are, it depends on the situation. But you can dance around an issue, and you can tease out and pull out aspects of an answer that cumulatively will answer the full question. But you can poke at aspects of something, and sometimes it's best not to come with a direct question about what it is that you're looking to learn about a negotiation or an item that you're looking to negotiate, but to ask indirect questions that tell a story, which indicate motivation, history, relationship with this item, motivation, desires. So questions that don't hit the target, but sort of get around the target a little bit, aren't threatening. They seem innocent enough with the other party, but they are revealing enough for you to be able to sort of paint a picture as to, okay, I think I get a better idea as to what's going on with this person and with their motivations as to why. But again, there are so many variables to what those questions might be. But if it's an item you're negotiating, say in your negotiation game, and it's for a piece of art that you're negotiating, and they're, you ask them what they're asking for, their opening bid, they say $1,000, but you have a feeling it's only worth half that. You can ask other questions about their interest in art. You can ask them about, do they have other items from that particular artist? Are they a fan of this particular type of art? These are types of questions that will help paint a picture as to, okay, where is this person at? Where are their motivations? Well, it turns out they have a whole bunch of this artist's stuff, or it turns out they don't have any of this artist's stuff. They're anxious to get rid of it because they're a collector and they like collecting lots of one artist. And this falls outside of what they normally do. So there's lots of ways to find out. There's no silver bullet question that's going to get you there. It's a matter of conversationally asking questions that fill in the blanks that might exist without going directly towards, the bullseye question.
And we already know that probably the right question is not, why the hell do you want $1,000 for this crap?
That's right. Try not to be offensive.
And start with why,
Right. Yes, exactly.
Okay. Good.
Or you can say, well, how did you come up with the $1,000 figure? That's using a how instead of a why. And that might be a gentler way to maybe get at the answer there.
Okay, so how come this crap costs $1,000? Okay, better question.
There you go. There you go.
That's gonna work. Okay, yeah, but jokes aside, so obviously, questioning can be very powerful, tool in your repertoire as a leader, as a manager, as an entrepreneur. So before the people will go and read your book, obviously. would you mention like, one perhaps tip that how to incorporate, strong questioning practices in their daily life right now?
I'm sorry, say it again. One what?
If you would say, like, is there one tip, one recommendation that you
Yeah.
can give to the listeners, how to incorporate the good questioning techniques into their life from now on?
Yeah. Well, again, questioning, as I was saying earlier, is a muscle that needs to be exercised. The more you do it, the more comfortable you become at it. You start with asking yourself better questions, which is part of the know thyself process of being able to sort of reach deep inside and ask questions of yourself. The more you do that, then you can practice then extending that out to others. I still believe that one of the more powerful, simple tips that I tend to be a fan of is the how versus why is a key. And this isn't just, it's so applicable in so many arenas. Certainly in interpersonal communication is big. In business, where you're working with a sales team who has lots of excuses as to why the numbers aren't where they should be, a how question might just break open that door. To a partner situation where they're having a difficult situation or a difficult experience, and you're there to try to help them out. A how question may be a more productive way to cover some territory, as opposed to saying, well, why do you feel this way? Or why are you so down about this situation? Or why does your boss treat you in such a poor way? And now those seem like certainly innocent questions, but they often don't open up a door to solutions. Whereas if you just reframed those questions with how, sometimes I get questions say, "Hey, I'm in a meeting with my team or with a larger team, and boy, I often ask why questions, and I think they're okay, but do you have a suggestion as to how I might ask a question or pose an idea to a group?" So it has you have a great idea. You have a team of 12 or 15 people at the table. You're all coming up with ideas on how to solve a problem. I often start with a question such as, would it make sense? And would it make sense, say I have an idea to solve a problem within the division, and it has to do with whatever. And instead of saying, hey, I think we should do this. All right, so there's the should. Or why don't we do this? Okay, there's the why again. Or why can't we do that? Okay, those are all legitimate questions. However, if you pose that same idea as sort of like, would it make sense to consider this approach? Now, what's nice about that kind of question is it invites everybody else to think about it. It doesn't act as if you have a definitive answer. You're posing an idea through a question vehicle, which then sort of like gets the burden off others and puts it in the middle of the table for everyone to take a look at. And then say, okay, well, would it make sense? I don't know. It might make sense. It may not. So the question becomes, does this make sense? Not so much like, I think we should do this, or here's the answer. So there's one other tip that I do myself often if I'm with a team and I have a very strong idea. Instead of saying, hey, I've got an idea, let's do this, I'll say, hey, have we thought about, or would it make sense to look at it this way instead of that way? I don't know, but does it? That simple question essentially just allows people to say, hey, okay, let's take a look at that. This person isn't throwing their ideas on us and saying, hey, this is the answer. Opening up the arena, posing an idea as a question, not as an answer, which then allows other people to contribute. Before you know it, you'll have more agreement around the table than acting as if it's your idea and this is how it is. What do you think it is, guys? So those two ideas, substituting how for why, and would it make sense, or something along those lines, to open up an idea around a table.
So really, it's a good start, for those who want to change their questioning practices. These two tips. Other tips, obviously, will be in your book. So how people can get your book? Where is it for sale? How to get it?
Right. Well, right now the book is currently available only on Amazon.com, right? So it's available on Amazon, and that's, at least at this point, that's where you'll get it. So log on to Amazon, look up The Art of the Question by Sean Grace. There's an older book called The Art of the Question. It's a totally different type of book, so don't confuse the two. Mine's the red cover.
Okay, so I think, for not to be confused, I will put the link, to the book into the episode description, so we can go straight, to the right book. When people are interested to learn more, perhaps to have a workshop with you, how to get in touch?
Yeah, the best way to contact me is through our website, which is PeakLuma, PeakLuma.com. So PeakLuma, peak being sort of the peak performance, ascending leadership, and Luma, which is light, sort of bringing out the brightest within you, and enlightenment as well. So those two ideas come together with PeakLuma.
Okay, so I think it's a very easy now to remember, but even, in a case that you don't, again, I will put the link in the episode description. So, Sean, thank you so much for this great discussion. I would say that it was quite eye-opening. Some very simple thing as asking the questions in a right way, how that can have powerful impact on how you interact with other people and how you are able to actually be a better person as a manager, as a leader, or as an entrepreneur. So thank you so much for providing these tips. For more, obviously, go to your book. Once again, appreciate and wish you all the good luck, with what you do, because it's quite unique, really. But as I say, it really makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Victor. I really appreciate the time and the opportunity to be on your program.
So, and if you enjoy Change Talks podcast, don't forget to follow us, give the episode or the podcast the 5-star rating, because that really tweaks the algorithm and it gets the content to more people who are just like you, interested in change. So until next time, have a great day and make the change work.